Hello, today I'd like to spend quite a few minutes talking about preparing for propagation. So I'm not going to do any seed sowing, not going to take any cuttings, but really I just want to talk you through all the bits and pieces that I think are important when you're planning to do any propagation. Reality is that you want to get the most that you can from your seeds or your cuttings, because obviously whether it's money you've actually spent on buying seed, or whether it's your actual time that you've spent taking cuttings, you want to get the best that you can. And it is very, very easy to do that, but similarly, it is very easy to make some mistakes with quite dire consequences. So, over this clip and the following clip, really I'm just going to go through all the bits and pieces that I think are important. So first off, I think we'll start at the beginning, and possibly the most important thing: good hygiene and keeping everything clean. Obviously, if you start off with everything clean, you've got less likelihood of picking up fungal disease and bits and pieces along the way. So starting off with the containers you're going to sow or take your cuttings in, make sure they're clean. Here on the nursery, anything that we sow into, and we mainly sow into seed trays, they're brand new. We only use them once. After we've used them for sowing, we don't throw them away, but they go on to be used for pot carrying, bits and pieces like that. So we only use them once when we're sowing anything like that at all. And similarly if we're using the smaller sort of division trays, etc, etc. Now obviously at home you're probably not going to take that sort of attitude and you use them more than once. If that's the case, make sure that you wash down with blazing hot water before you use them again, and obviously keep them clean and dry and somewhere where they're not going to pick up muck and rubbish. So it's great to have them underneath the bench, but before you use them, just make sure that they are clean. Similarly, if you're going to use things like meat trays or what have you from the supermarket, give them a really good, jolly good wash out, and wash them out before you actually use them. Not wash them out, pop them away, and then use them later. Wash them the day before you're going to use them or what have you. The other important thing for cleanliness and for plant hygiene is the water that you're actually going to use for watering or spraying the cuttings with. Now here on the nursery, we're not on mains water. So the main tank for the nursery is a big outside tank that is open at the top. But we don't use that water for any of our propagation at all. We have a separate tank here that we have for drinking water that once again comes out of the ground, but it's a sealed, sterile tank. And we place as much importance on our plant propagation as we would on, say, drinking. So anything that water-wise is used on the plants in their early stages comes from that sealed tank, the tank that we drink from ourselves. And moving on one more stage from that, we only use one watering can, or we've actually got a couple, but they're only used with that water. So the two things I'd say, taking that back to a home environment, would be: firstly, have a watering can that you only use on your propagation and bits and pieces, so not the one that sits outside in the garden or on the allotment, what have you. Have a specific can for watering your seedlings. And the other thing is, don't use your water from the water butt or what have you. Make the effort to use tap water from home that you know to be clean. So if that means dragging it from home to the allotment, make that effort, because it really can make a huge difference on getting a really good germination rate with your seeds and seedlings. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is compost, and this is an area that really is one of my major bugbears. I see quite a lot on forums, etc., people saying, oh, I bought this compost, I got it very, very cheap, I got X bags for this price. And the reality is that compost is one of those big areas where you do get what you pay for. So if you're getting bargain compost, there is a reason. It may be because it's last year's and it's sat around forever and ever. Or it may just be that it is very, very poor quality, and you need the best start you can for your seedlings and your cuttings. So this is an area I really do think it is important to spend that little bit extra, and the dividends will pay off. Here on the nursery, we do have the luxury of obviously our own compost producing plant. This is the beginning of January. and we're actually going to start our seed sowings in earnest tomorrow, being Monday. This compost was mixed on Friday, so it's very, very fresh. The trays are all filled, ready to be used, and that is one of the big areas with compost, that it needs to be fresh. Because whatever fertilizer, whether it's an organic fertilizer or a chemical based fertilizer in there, as soon as it gets in contact with the growing medium, peat, core or what have you, it will actually start to release its nutrient. So a 6 to 8 month old compost that's been sitting around at the garden centre or what have you will have already released most of its nutrient, which will cause one of two problems. A, there will be nothing left in the compost, so there's nothing there for anything to grow away on, or the worst situation, which quite often happens, is it's actually released into the compost, so the compost is very, very strong. So once again, for the seeds, it's too strong for them, really. And that brings me on to the other point of multi-purpose compost. The reality is you need a seed compost or a seed and cutting compost. You can't have such a thing as a multi-purpose compost when it comes to trying to produce plants from seed and cuttings and trying to grow plants on and pot them up, because their nutrient levels that they require are so different. So it's impossible to put that all into one compost. So really do spend some money on compost, or spend some money and make your own compost from the base ingredients, which is quite easy. And I hope to do a clip on that sometime in the future. And the other thing with your compost, whether you do buy it or what have you, is make sure it's nice and free draining. Now here on the nursery we actually use vermiculite in our compost to open it up. You can use grit, you could use perlite. We personally, or we prefer vermiculite. It really does open up nicely, keeps the air in there, and helps with nutrient retention as well. So yeah, we make the compost here on the nursery. As you can see, it's very open. There's quite a lot of vermiculite in it. In actual fact, there's double the amount of vermiculite we use in this to what we would in a potting compost. So it is very, very open. So yeah, you need a good quality compost to make sure you're going to get the best from your seeds and your cuttings. The reality is that that compost is the key part of seed sowing. Many people will sit there and blame that their seed hasn't germinated, etc., etc. And the reality is, one of the main things it could be is because you're using poor compost. It could be sitting too wet. It could have no nutrient. It could have too much nutrient, so the seeds throw out their first little roots and the roots burn off in the excessive nutrients. So compost is very, very important. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is choice of tray, etc. What you're actually going to grow and sow your bits and pieces in. Now the reality is that the seeds don't really care what they go into, and the cuttings don't really care what they go into. So it's more a case of making sure that you get the right container for what you're doing, and something that obviously fits in with you. So if you're just doing a few bits and pieces on the windowsill, which is fine, meat trays, bits and pieces like that from the supermarket are fantastic. Obviously also people can use things like yogurt pots, anything like that. As I say, just make sure they're clean, but they're fine. They're perfectly fine, perfectly adequate for sowing a few seeds and bits and pieces. Here on the nursery, obviously we sow in large quantities, so we spend most of our time sowing into a standard seed tray, which is reasonable size. We'll fill the whole tray with one variety of seed. Now in the amateur situation, there's going to be many occasions where you're not going to need that much compost. You're not going to be growing that much of one single plant. So you do see an awful lot of people when they've got their seed tray with compost and they divide them up with sticks and what have you, which is fine, it's perfectly fine. But of course the problem is, if you've got various species of things in one tray, they may actually germinate at different times, and then you've got the problem that they may need to be pricked out, which is fine because obviously you can put the tray back, but they may need to grow on in that tray for a little bit, but they won't appreciate the extra heat or what have you that they're giving them. So I quite like these. We use these here on the nursery as well, which they fit inside a standard seed tray, and I would always say to put them inside a standard seed tray rather than using them as is, because they're just a bit too floppy otherwise. You can cut them up beforehand if you want, or leave them as the full sheet. But the beauty of these is obviously you've got 4 distinct spots for sowing. So for instance, if you were growing tomatoes or chilies or something, you could actually sow 4 different varieties into the one tray, see which is important, but obviously if one germinates quicker than the other, you can then take it away, move it elsewhere, so it's not on your prop area. So they're quite handy, and they're quite cheap, and once again, with a little bit of care, these would wash and be usable quite a few times, I would think. But my tip on those would be always make sure you put them in a seed tray, because they are just too floppy as is. Moving on from that, we also use little 7cm pots. These are quite handy, and once again, as I say, something like a yogurt carton or what have you would be similarly as good. These are great if you're sowing something like tomatoes. You can probably sow 10 seeds in here, something like that, so they're wonderful for that sort of thing. If you're sowing cucurbits and squashes, those sort of things, I would most certainly sow into these, and that's exactly what we do, because then you don't get the root disturbance, and you can sow the plant or sow the seed into here and grow it on into the plant ready to go into the garden, so no disturbance whatsoever. And in actual fact, with our pumpkin competition that we do each year with a lot of local schools, this is the size of pot that we grow the pumpkins in for the school kids, and we grow quite a lot of them, as in the thousands. But they're a nice size pot. That's a 7cm pot, and once again it fits into a special tray, but they would fit into a standard seed tray as well, but obviously this has got a little division in them so they don't flip and flop about, so they're quite handy. Moving on from that, for some sowings, and this tray isn't clean, we use a module tray like this. Now, we would use a tray like this for things like peas and beans. And once again, it's a nice sized tray. It's the same size as a seed tray, actually. It's a 40 cell tray, so you'll be able to produce 40 of something in it, or multiples thereof. But this is perfect for starting off things like, as I say, peas and beans and bits and pieces like that. You can grow away to so high, and then transplant them straight out into the garden. So that's a nice tray, and is perfect for that sort of thing where you don't want to disturb the root as much. We also use that actually for fuchsia propagation and some of the softer plants and some of our soft fruits and bits and pieces like that. So it's not too big a module, and it's fine for those sort of smaller bits and pieces. When we get on to grapes and things like that, when we're taking cuttings of grapes, we use this larger module tray. They've got no bottom. Once again, they're filled up with the same compost, but they've got a nice depth, so you can get an inch or two of the cutting in there, and you've still got an inch below also, so that's a nice size tray for that as well. You can also, not that you're meant to, but you can actually start, for instance, parsnips or carrots off in something like this, and if you're really quick and really lucky, you won't end up with forked roots. But I have to be honest and say it's much better with things like that to direct sow them into the garden. But if you want to have a go, then get a really nice deep tray and just look closely at what you're doing. And finally, the final tray is these mesh bottom prop trays, which are used for other hardwood cuttings and bits and pieces like that. As you can see, you've got a beautiful depth, so you've got something like about 10 centimeters depth there, so they really do take a good volume of compost. They're perfect for lots and lots of hardwood cuttings, but obviously the issue is when you're potting up from this, you have the problem that they're not in modules, so you will disturb the roots that the plants have just put out. But these trays do most certainly have a use for when you're doing larger woodier subjects. So I think really that's it for trays and bits and pieces, and I guess the next thing to go on to will be talking about where you're actually going to do all this propagation.